That was
it's
recorded, right?
it's all being recorded. I actually never talk to anyone on Skype without recording it in the background.
Oh, that's
just for
that's
evidence.
great.
Yeah.
Hashtag me too.
You like Nixon, Alex? You just record everything that happens.
Yeah,
Just in case.
Do you keep like different folders, one for your like wank bank, and one for your blackmail, and one for your like your own nervous episodes?
Nixon is my spirit animal.
Mine too, but only because I worship at the altar of Roger Stone.
Dude, Roger Stone's tattoo is so badass.
Yeah, his tattoo proves that he likes getting pegged like Ralphie Cifaretto because he has it on his back.
Yeah, just to add for added detail, Alex's little podcast setup is next to a mirror, which I find kind of creepy.
Is it?
Well, like it's a bit like with the recording that everything I do on Skype, I also always have a mirror within close proximity of myself to keep tabs on my own self. So
is this because like you're like Patrick Bateman, you're like fucking and looking in like texting?
but except that I get off on podcasting, so you know. Anyway, Anna, how would you like to be?
what's more narcissistic?
Yeah, definitely podcasting. Hey there, welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. Today we're talking to Anna Khachiyan about modern relationships, dating, narcissism, and alienation. If this sounds slightly offbeat for a politics podcast, don't worry, we get onto things like Russophobia, fascism, and anti-fascism a bit towards the end. If this is your first time with us, our starting point is that the period in which Western liberal democracy was held to be the final form of human government is now over. So what we try to do here is to chart what's emerging and what comes next. We alternate between episodes on ideas and ideology, concrete national politics, and cultural themes. So while our last episode was with Amberly Frost talking about the family and socialist feminism, the one before that was on Brazil. Okay, here's the episode. Alright, hi everyone, I'm Alex Hochuli. We have Ben Fogel, who's I think in Berlin, continuing his globetrotting. We have George Hoare, who's in London, and our very special guest today, Anna Khachiyan, who is in New York. Anna, I think, is a depressed writer and podcaster by her own description. Her podcast, she's one third of Red Scare, which is actually really great, and we would endorse you listening to it after you listen to this one. Today we're talking about modern relationships. So I'm going to start off with a quote from the great romantic Slavoj Žižek to kind of set us off and set the scene. So if we try to imagine I'm not going to do the voice, by the way. If we try to imagine a wholly politically correct courtship, we get uncannily close to a formal market contract. The problem is that sexuality, power, and violence are much more intimately intertwined than we may expect it, so that also elements of what is considered brutality can be sexualized, i.e. libidinally invested. After all, sadism and masochism are forms of sexual activity. As a result, sexuality purified of violence and power games can well end up getting desexualized. So, as a starter, Anna, is it the case that under neoliberalism we've forgotten how to fuck? I didn't write that question, someone else did. I'm just reading this.
I can't speak for anybody else, but I suspect that that's true. As my co-host Dasha brilliantly said on Red Scare, neoliberalism has made it so that men grow increasingly autistic and women grow increasingly traumatized. So the original kind of men are from Mars, women are from Venus distinction, the idea that there's like an inherent pre-verbal miscommunication between the sexes, I think has been amplified by like digital platforms.
Which is weird because, the kind of one of the few bits of real progress you could say over the past kind of 20, 30 years in the West has been a kind of a greater gender equality, I think. And yet the men and women seem further apart. So how do we explain that?
Well, I think the difficulty, the central kind of contradiction of our time of like in terms of like gender roles is the fact that yes, we as progressives can all agree that we aspire to greater gender equality professionally and publicly, but the sexual arena, and Zizek has said this, and Camille Paglia has said this, among others, that in the sexual arena there is no equality. I think Zizek, I don't know if you were quoting this, the Mobius strip of sexual contracts. Was that where the quote was from?
I think that's right.
Yeah. Here's another even better quote. I think it's better because it's much more like cruel and to the point. The fact that should be accepted in all its brutality is the ultimate incompatibility of sexuality and human rights. And I think that Paglia had also a very kind of spicy take on this, and which was that you can't legislate sexual matters. So although there has been a greater kind of equalization in gender roles across the board in Western developed countries, the sexual terrain still remains kind of like uncharted, and I think people don't know what to do with it.
Well, I guess one way of just thinking about it would be to think of kind of sexual relations as somehow sort of pre-political. And when people say, don't kink shame, that's what they're kind of touching on, that you can't really judge these things because they're so intimately tied to your own impulses that you can't really judge them. They're not of the realm of kind of rational discussion. And so I guess the question then is discussing dating, as we're doing on this podcast, is that kind of a frivolous topic of discussion for a political podcast? I guess on the other hand, people are kind of dating and having these questions much later into life than was in the past. Relationships are much less permanent, much more transient. And so you end up in a situation of dating probably much longer along the course of your life than, 30 years ago. Does this make it a valuable topic for political discussion?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think like sexual relations are always in some sense political because we're talking about the kind of numero uno function of humanity, which is to perpetuate itself. I know that there's a lot of people on the left who fall, not a lot, but there's a robust minority, let's say, of people who are like part of this anti-natalist camp who, are so sick in the head that they actually believe that humans shouldn't reproduce, that we should do kind of the moral thing. But certainly, I mean, when you talk about the issue of people kind of dating later in life, cohabitating later in life, like that's a political question, right? Because we're talking about procreation.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things I noticed in, I guess, left circles in New York is that, like, kind of the normalization of kink. Like, there's now, like, a social network for, like, every type of kink imaginable and, like, FetLife and all of these BDSM communities, but it's presented as sort of, like, a comfortable, safe identity as if it was, like, not transgressive, as it was, like, we just go knit by the fireplace.
Yeah, isn't that like a delicious irony of the sexual revolution, that all of these things that were kind of originally taboo and transgressive are now totally like neutered? Like you can really go to any shop in like Dime Square, NYC, and like buy like a fair trade organic dildo, and people are very upfront now about their kinks. People are very upfront, for example, about their consumption of like pornography, to the point that like it has the adverse effect and that it makes all of this very like clinical and uninteresting.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's also like this whole like thing, and I guess it's like a subgenre of like mid to late 2000s Vice era journalism, which was like, I'm a like professional sex worker, I work as a dom, and I like piss on and beat the shit out of finance guys all day, but I go home and live my normal life afterwards, and that's praxis.
I mean,
yeah. The sex worker thing is... No, you go ahead.
Well, I mean, I guess it does bring up a question which we might discuss a little bit more in depth later on, but I want to throw this in there already, which is when we make that critique, and I kind of agree with at least the observation that it's a bit odd these days, that are we not wishing for a time which the mainstream was more repressed, and then that we could be the alternative people on the outside? It's a bit like wanting your speakeasy bar to be a real 1920s speakeasy bar under Prohibition rather than the kind of farcical things that they are nowadays, where you have speakeasy bars that everybody knows about.
Yeah, it's like a there's all these establishments now that are basically cosplaying like as retro institutions.
Right.
Like you can go to like a speakeasy bar or kind of like a rustic Colorado style coffee shop or whatever. And the whole thing is like profoundly embarrassing. It's like that Sky Ferreira song, Everything is Embarrassing. Like you walk through life and you're like, Jesus, I'm constantly experiencing secondhand embarrassment chills. And it makes it that much worse that like you have friends and partners that you have to suffer through it with together. And both sides have to pretend that they don't notice kind of the embarrassment of the other side, because to like mutually acknowledge that would be even more embarrassing.
Maybe that's why we're anxious all the time. It's just that we're cringing so deeply all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like I remember in Williamsburg, I always used to walk past it, and I didn't understand why like everyone just didn't commit suicide involved in this project. There was a Australian-owned, Australian-run, and Australian-themed coffee shop called Sweatshop, like on the border with Williamsburg and Bed-Stuy. Where they probably were like a sweatshop, like 60 years ago, and I was just like, okay.
Is this where your hatred of Australians comes from, Ben?
Oh, it's symptomatic rather than a causal.
I think we can all agree that we hate the French and the Australians, right?
Yeah.
I like the image of France that I have. I don't like the empirical French, but I like France as an idea.
So maybe to move things on from sort of ranking nations sort of worst to least worst.
No, I said this before, and I'll say again: the French you at least have to have a begrudging respect for, because they are such crypto racists and crypto fascists. Like they're so kind of openly so that you almost have to respect their commitment. They have like real skin in the game.
Take your hat off to. They're really committed. But just kind of taking it back a bit to this Zizek quote, and I think one of the things which sort of resonated with me when Alex was reading that out is, I mean, we have got in many ways a dating market now, and we have dating apps which measurement, evaluation, quantification. There's a lot of data which is going into these processes of sorting and matching, and it's obviously also big money. I mean, is there any way to escape this, or are we, should we just basically accept this is an efficiency that the market gives us? It saves us time. People are busy. It's a way to meet people that we actually like sometimes, or even love.
I mean, yeah, this is certainly true, and like I won't discount the fact that like yes, people have met on dating apps or on the internet, and by and large, like as much as I kvetch about this, I've met many of my best friends just through like talking shit on Twitter. But at the same time, I think that there is an escape, and that's kind of becoming a private citizen. I think Massimiliano Gioni, who was like the director of the New Museum, said this once in an article in New York Magazine way back, that the only way to be like radical and transgressive these days is to be boring and a little bit difficult.
Yeah, I think especially the difficult thing, because otherwise I think the normal fine, but then there's a certain acting out of normcore. It's kind of a performative normcoreism, which is also really cringy. But certainly the point about difficulty, I think, is important. And I think if there's one sort of notion which our contemporary culture is very much against, is that things be difficult. That one should stick fervently to a principle. Like that's just seen as like,
or that one should suffer any kind of inconvenience, which in modern kind of techno-capitalist parlance has been rebranded as inefficiency.
Yeah. So the social theorist Adam Greenfield talks about this, the ideology of ease. Your whole life is, everything has to be easy. If it's not, it's not easy.
And what you see increasingly is people having a lower and lower threshold for discomfort and inefficiency. And I actually think what you were saying, going back to what you were saying earlier, the idea that dating apps and such save time because we are busy, and it basically algorithmically matches us to people who have maybe a statistically higher chance of being compatible with us. That's in some sense an illusion, because our busyness is an illusion. I mean, if you think of our class of like aspirational creative millennials, i.e. podcasters, writers, artists, musicians, whatever.
You make me want to kill myself right now.
I mean, we are all people who are in the business of manufacturing tasks for ourselves, and I think that we've, in some sense, turned to work to avoid the discomfort of and the terror, the existential terror of interpersonal relationships.
That is, yeah, I think are those two things different though? I mean, is it on the one hand that making it easy is good for us, and then on the other hand, does it reflect that we're actually increasingly scared of each other in this impersonal and kind of market mediated approach to meeting people? It reduces the risk and it keeps people at arm's length a bit longer.
Yeah, of course. And I think like Me Too, somebody said this on Twitter, and I really appreciated the sentiment that Me Too fundamentally, for all of its like kind of ambitious goals and progressive bona fides, is basically a reactionary movement that is pushing back against kind of the frivolity of the sexual revolution, because people want constraints and people want standards.
Well, I think this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but something brought the thought to mind when you talked about the desire for ease, which is the notion of social acceleration, right? That thing that things are always getting faster and that things are always on. And it actually, it kind of thinking about this made me more convinced about the need for national holidays, and actually people don't seem to be able to tolerate the idea that, for example, all the shops might be shut. And it's not just out of a desire to go shopping, but it's just that things must be always on and always happening. And the idea of a kind of national holiday or a Sunday where all the shops are closed and where you might go and meet people in a public square seems something which is difficult and an obstacle to getting things done and to pursuing your tasks. And I think maybe it's a good argument. That's exactly a good argument for defending the notion of holidays where everything stops and where you might have a publicly shared moment.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, it's difficult. Like you have this much less so in America, but in Europe, an example, like in Berlin, right, everything closes. In London, everything closes at like 8 p.m. or whatever on a Sunday. And people are sort of left to their own devices to like drink themselves under the table because, you know, there's that famous, right, Keynesian idea. I think it was the Keynesian idea that as labor is more and more automated, people will have more leisure time and they will be more free to pursue their kind of hobbies and interests. And of course that's exactly what didn't happen. People filled up that surplus leisure time with more work.
Yeah, I think it's also that we're quite puritanical in Britain. We're quite worried if we have free time, that's like idleness, that's a sin. You know, it leads to drink and dissolution. We actually kind of like to work and keep busy because it's better than the alternative of just getting drunk and being amoral.
Well, I would say actually probably in Britain that people are either always drunk or always working. It's sobriety and leisure is like, whoo, that's a bit of a void
like
we don't want to face.
Profoundly incompatible, yeah. I mean, I don't know. You guys remember the book that came out a couple of years ago that was kind of like very talked about probably in our circles called Inventing the Future. It was by Nick Srinick. I don't know how to pronounce his name, and Alex Williams. And I'm looking at it now. It's on my bookshelf. But it was basically an attempt to kind of identify, to codify neoliberalism as a political and cultural strategy. And it was interesting as an expository work and that to that degree, but they also kind of tangentially fleshed out this idea of folk politics, which is people kind of receding into their individual private lives and kind of pitching community-based protest movements, and they dismiss this mode of operating as basically ineffectual. And I think it has largely, like in the era of massive like data harvesting digital platforms, it has proven ineffectual politically. But I think as a personal social stance, it's wildly redeeming because that's what's called for with kind of the dating apps and stuff. Like I personally don't use dating apps for that reason because I think that they're corrosive. And it's, you know, going back to what I was saying about Me Too being a reactionary movement, I think people these days don't realize just how deeply kind of damaging, harmful dating apps have been to dating culture, especially to women.
I mean, it's connected, but One other thing I noticed about living in New York and as someone from like kind of a different place in the world is that like the spontaneity of just hanging out with your friends is often lost to the requirements of work. And the same goes for dating. It's like you have to schedule like 3 weeks in advance if you want to see somebody. It's not like if you suddenly have some time, you can really call up somebody and say, hey, let's go to the bar. That like that spontaneity of being able to hang out or encounter people like that is kind of lost. Everything has to be scheduled and ordered in advance, and you have to book people in advance. It's like I find that extremely stressful and depressing.
It is, and because the spontaneity has been discouraged because it's dried up, I think that's only amplified, kind of like I said, the existing miscommunication between the sexes, because both sides know that the other side can cook up a perfectly reasonable, sensible excuse for why the spontaneous meeting can't occur.
Yeah, and I mean it's also like, especially I find in like New York, having been on many dates in New York, there's also like this.
Don't brag. It's not nice.
It's not brag. It's just
there's nothing to brag about. It's actually really depressing.
Trust me. This is not something to brag about. Like you would want to go on less dates. Dates are not a good thing in this case. It's like there's always like this weird distance in that people both know kind of why they're there, but they can't admit it.
Yeah. Sure.
So one thing that I wanted to come on to, which is related to this question of folk politics, and I'm glad you raised that, because I mean, just as a personal anecdote, a personal political anecdote, I used to be much more of an accelerationist than I am now. And actually, there's this book, Social Acceleration, by German theorist Hartmut Rosa, which rather convinced me that if there's things that you want to defend in modernity, such as personal and political autonomy, then we actually have to decelerate in certain aspects, many of which are kind of things that you have already mentioned in terms of being always on, about setting yourself more and more tasks, always multitasking, and actually have time to reflect and think is actually quite important. Precisely to be, if we want to be as modern as possible, we have to kind of decelerate, which is a kind of seemingly paradoxical notion. But as a kind of instinctive progressive, I guess it does sort of jar a little bit to be thinking these things. So I guess my question is, are we becoming more conservative in general? And is our approach to relationships maybe just one aspect of this?
Yeah, I think that there is a tendency toward conservatism. I mean, I think Angela Nagel made this point very kind of astutely and succinctly in Kill All Normies, and she got pretty much pilloried and crucified for it. And her point,
Angela, she's been on the podcast.
Yeah, shout out to Angela, friend of the pod. But she, her point, right, was that the modern alt-right cannot exist without the modern online left. That they're mirror images of each other, and you can extrapolate that analogy to the way that kind of the fringe elements of like male and female discourse operate on the internet. Like you have on one hand these incel guys that were like in the news recently, and kind of their reluctant troubadour Jordan Peterson, who was advocating for like the sexual redistribution of women in the absence of any other kind of political redistributions which would benefit everybody equally, which I thought was an interesting point, because these people are kind of like bald-faced libertarians in all respects, except when it comes to sexuality. There, everybody is appointed a girlfriend according to his need. And then on the other hand, you have kind of the putatively progressive wings of leftist and liberal feminism, which is on the face of things concerned with, seeking solidarity with their sisters and seeking justice for sexual abuses, both of which are, I think, noble pursuits. But what they're really interested in the most kind of extreme sense, is getting revenge against individual men in the guise of like avenging the patriarchy. So they're basically like, if you think of like the kind of like misandrist, like kill all men, male tears mugs feminists, they are merely the mirror image of incel men.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know where to go from that. I guess it does leave us in a situation where we're obviously unsure of what social norms should be. That, there's a general progressive consensus that we should be tolerant and people should be allowed to do what they want to do, but without any serious ethical undergirding to that. And I guess that's why you see so much grappling for new forms of rules, or even kind of, punitive responses. Like, this person has overstepped the boundaries, we need to punish them and publicly flog them, because that's the only way of establishing what a potential norm could be. And I guess one thing which I was thinking the other day is that it seemed, on the one hand, I feel like social liberalism hasn't gone far enough. We could be more tolerant, we could be more liberal. At the same time, social liberals as a distinct political grouping have gone too far. They've overreached. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Zizek's point was very correct, that like as sexual relations have become more automated and transactionalized, what happens is that kind of the original tacit, unspoken power asymmetries are maybe minimized, but there arise more other different imbalances or asymmetries that are part and parcel of turning sex into contractual agreement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that it is a kind of recourse to liberal contractualism as the only because of the lack of a kind of an ethical order. It's kind of replacing ethics with rules, with contracts.
It's safe, isn't it? It's it gets rid of any risk. The more contractual and the more the clearer it is.
But this is a very kind of material question, because I think what's going on is that we're truly in the midst of like a paradigm shift in gender roles, and nobody knows what to do, how to proceed. And it's very clear that politically, I think the political agenda is very obvious. Women deserve equal representation as political subjects, whether that means that they have an equal right to vote or operate machinery or whatever, or earn an equal wage to men. But on the other hand, what we're talking about in the terrain of sexuality is kind of more of a cultural or sociological imbalance that is much less easy to grapple with. I mean, for example, the big question now with all these kind of online media and alt-lit shakeups that we see is how do you deal with men mistreating women when a crime hasn't occurred? When the guy is guilty basically of being like a shitty date or a shitty boyfriend.
Yeah.
There's been some high profile examples of this.
Yeah.
I mean, I think maybe a lot of what maybe where we're going sounds quite bleak and uncompromising. I mean, is there any hope for an idea of something approaching love under neoliberalism? I mean, is there any reasons why listeners and also I guess Ben in Berlin as well should be hopeful?
I mean, sure, on an individual case by case basis, absolutely. It's not like a cut and dry binary, but you have to be very conscientious and you have to be kind of very aware of what you hope to accomplish, and you have to nurture. I mean, love is something that has to be nurtured. You have to work for it. And that means, unfortunately for us, parlaying some of the energies that we devote to work into the realm of interpersonal relations. If that's what you want.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the big constraint, isn't it? Though, that we don't have time for love and work, and you've got to eat. You've got to pay rent. So.
Well, I mean, I guess it also ties into a question which has broader social and political implications, which is the notion of commitment, and commitment as being true freedom. Can refer to Sartre here or whoever, which relates to this question of working on a relationship, that you have to grow to love someone. And that runs pretty contrary to the notion that, well, one, an app can engineer this for you and that it'll be instantaneous. And that secondly, that you might have to ride out some difficult bits and that you have to work through that and actually commit to something on principle and see that through rather than just expecting things to work out. And if they don't work out, it means that it's not meant to be. Somehow the universe has determined this to be wrong for you.
Can I just jump in here quickly?
Go for it.
I was going to say, connecting this discussion of like love is work with instant gratification and this paradigm shift that Anna referred to earlier. If I remember correctly, I think this is about mid to late 2000s, in terms of like what like alt-lit or whatever it was called, like sort of was cool in terms of writing, was basically to refer to how shitty you were at relationships. It was like a whole subgenre of like, I'm emotionally dead. I can't really feel anything despite like sleeping or being with somebody, which seems to have like been a thing before dating apps. But now with dating apps are supposed to cure this, sort of like make things easier. But I see something like basically people are already afraid of committing to something, which makes them feel vulnerable or shows vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this goes back even before dating apps. It's been a thing about like being vulnerable is seen as lame. It's just like, you know, like who writes a love letter anymore?
I mean, we do all the time in text messages, but this is like the crazy thing that like now all of our communiques are basically recorded. They exist in some kind of online archive, which is a terrifying thing because I think a lot of the stuff depends. It thrives basically on the absence of absolutes and the presence of ambiguity.
Well, I mean, Ben, your point about vulnerability is actually kind of interesting because on the one hand, we all flaunt vulnerability, or not necessarily us individually, but I mean, there's a culture in which you are meant to flaunt your vulnerability, right? You're meant to break down and cry and repent.
It's a performance of vulnerability.
It's a performance of vulnerability, but genuinely being vulnerable is not a defensive posture, whereas the display of vulnerability, the performative vulnerability, is a defensive mechanism, isn't it?
Right. That's very well said. Yeah. And I think like, I mean, you see this now basically with all of these like Twitter threads disclosing some or other sexual trauma that was not criminal. And I think, now one of the things that's like very sad for me is the death of Mark Fisher, because I think like I'm very curious to what he would have to say about the fact that we've kind of officially moved on from an ironic to post-ironic moment in the span of like maybe 1 or 2 decades. So now we do live in this atmosphere of post-irony where it's no longer cool to be kind of emo and ironic, and everybody is bearing their soul on the internet, but nobody is actually willing to be vulnerable in private.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think this would bring us on really nicely to a topic that you've written about and talk a lot about, which is the notion of narcissism. And would you see, I guess, to put the question pointedly, both the ironic culture and the post-ironic culture, both as facets of a narcissistic culture, or is it something different?
How do you mean?
Well, I guess the irony is a sort of a defensiveness, right? And post-irony in the forms of, flaunting one's vulnerability, as we've discussed, both are inwardly focused. And, it's not narcissism in the sense of, wow, I'm really fucking great. How awesome am I? But just an inward turn, right? It's the kind of fall of public man and so on. So I guess is post-irony also a facet of that?
I would say so. I mean, I have to think about it, but I'm certain it is. I think of narcissism when you think about it, the way that it's been diagnosed. I think The Last Psychiatrist had a really great bit about this bit that he played out on his blog over many posts. That narcissism, the way that it's diagnosed by the psychiatric community, is basically it provides a giant elaborate defense mechanism for everybody who suffers from a touch of narcissism, to the degree that we are told that narcissism is grandiosity, that it's egomania, that it's extreme self-love, when of course it's not necessarily positive self-preoccupation. It's self-preoccupation in the absolute. So accompanied also by feelings of like extreme alienation and self-loathing and paranoid ideations that people are conspiring against you and that the world is hostile when it's really indifferent. And like a lot of people that you see like screaming into the void and being like ostensibly like vulnerable online are people who refuse to accept help from people in private life. I mean, there's the joke that, so many things that we air out on social media could have been a private note, could have been an email. Like you even think about the standard of people kind of praising, lauding their friends on the internet for some accomplishment, right? To me, public praise is akin to like a public apology in the sense that it's meaningless. It's like a rat race to obtain like clout or social capital, because if you really wanted to be earnest with somebody, whether that be like praiseworthy or contrite, you would write them a private note or call them up.
I heard a really interesting explanation of why people have moved to these forms of like why publicly praise a friend of yours. It is quite a strange idea, but it was linking it to basically the growing inequality, and particularly in American society, that basically people have internalized this and now are basically, even in things which previously would have been private, that now there's something to be gained from sort of trying to get a bit higher up in the status hierarchy, and always essentially competing, even in things which used to be, I don't know, privatized and non-competitive.
I think for instance, like one of the things I've noticed is like, and I'm like, I have a lot of friends who are like much older than me, particularly in South Africa, and who are not really on social media like that. And there's this whole thing. It's like when you really with a friend and really want to show love, a lot of it, like for younger people, it really has to be like on Instagram stories. But if you're like really having a very intimate, like deep evening and conversation with somebody, the urge to whip out your phone and record it seems kind of like obscene.
Yeah. Well,
I agree. But it comes down to like private practice. Like you have to make a commitment before you make a commitment to anybody else. You must make a commitment to yourself that you will behave in a way that you will basically behave in a way that answers your sense of like communitarian duty. So if that means like not whipping your phone out at dinner to kind of like moderate discomfort, then that's the way that you have to proceed.
It's kind of that versus the need to to build a brand, which includes being human, relatable, friendly, and obviously all of those things publicly.
And it also fits into your relationships, because like part of the thing about like these sort of uncertain encounters that we have with people romantically interested in is to demonstrate we actually have a fulfilling life without them.
Right, exactly. And that's the game. I mean, that's historically been the game, I think, which is natural and normal, is like pretending you're not as invested in somebody as you really are, and like both sides are playing the game, and eventually if it works out, you reach a mutual agreement. If it doesn't, you part ways. I mean, that's also all par for the course, but I think now we're experiencing because we have to think of these things. I think there's kind of like a leftist notion that progress, that's probably an American notion, because I've noticed one thing about American culture is that it's absolutely unable to stomach moral ambiguity, or nuance, which is kind of different from European or Russian culture or whatever. But now I think the situation we face is one where women have entered the workplace en masse, and they are, even though they're compensated less on average, right, they're equal players in the workplace. So the old role of a man, let's say, being like a patriarch and a provider is completely eroded, and that's, by and large, it's a good thing, because we don't actually want to go back to the way things were. Nobody actually wants to be like barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. But on the other hand, men now don't know how they should behave, and neither do women, and that's because women and men are now directly competing with each other in the labor market.
So just to kind of link some of this stuff a bit, maybe more explicitly to politics, although obviously all this stuff is kind of is politicized anyway. So somebody whose work you talk about quite a lot, Camille Paglia, she's quite uncertain, says often in quite uncertain terms that what masquerades as feminism currently is just packaging up a load of personal neuroses and individual grievances. I guess so maybe the question from all of this is how do we get beyond kind of this critique of some current feminists and start to build something a bit better? I mean, following on from maybe some of the, because I think it's been quite a critical discussion in some ways. We've identified some of the negative stuff. Is there a positive dialectical move here?
In terms of feminism?
Yeah, in terms of, I guess, how does all of this diagnosis maybe lead to some prescriptions, perhaps feminist? I
mean, like, I think the prescription for political action is actually for all of the kind of spirited debate about it is actually fairly straightforward. We keep fighting for equal rights for women, for their access, for easy, affordable access to healthcare, abortion, etc. But as far as the interpersonal realm is concerned, I don't think there is any easy prescription. I mean, I'm not clairvoyant. I've thought about this. I think, like, I agree with you that we should move past critique and into prescription, but it's very difficult to even think about how things could proceed in the future. What is, I think, patently obvious now is that women are equally capable of being narcissists as men.
Well, I think
I was kind of hoping you'd have a very simple.
We're living in the post-Lena Dunham era. I think that's patently obvious.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one thing that's very difficult to express to anybody, which is often like billed, I often get a lot of flack for, victim shaming or victim blaming, is that a lot of what passes for political discourse right now is really the politicizing of personal grievance.
I think there's something interesting in the personal grievance aspect, and it also relates to what we were talking a little bit earlier about flaunting one's vulnerability, as well as, congratulating friends in public, as well as flaunting your own traumas, which is, there's an element of self-dramatization in there that I always think is quite relevant, or at least it's an aspect of it that strikes me quite strongly. Turning unpleasant but relatively quotidian situations into a big drama, something that, you can hear the strings playing in the background. And
I think the
tiny violin, except it's a whole orchestra, in the person's head, it's a whole fucking orchestra. And I guess you because you want to feel like the universe cares, that this is a big cinematic moment, which kind of, I don't know, I have a difficulty trying to understand what that means in a context which we also know that people are very cynical, very contractual, which are all the stuff which runs against the romance. This is all a big prelude to get us talking about Lana del Rey. Because I think she's the last romantic of our times. And I think the appeal that she has is in part this kind of grand romance, grand emotion, which is something which isn't very common or popular or respected in our contemporary culture.
Right. I mean, you took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah.
But it's weird because you also have this self-dramatization, which is kind of pathetic and tawdry at the same time as a desire for a real sort of genuine drama, genuine romance, things that really matter, that you might sacrifice something for.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, before we get to Lana, I mean, I would just like to point out that as far as, narcissism goes, I think that the reason that you have so many people kind of offloading, crowdsourcing their private pain and vulnerability on the internet is that in a classic narcissist move, we want we want sympathy and attention without kind of subordinating our wills to other people, without the kind of unpleasant or uncomfortable effects of that, which is that if you are vulnerable with people in private, it is in fact a social contract, and you also owe them, you have a duty and an obligation to them as well. And we want kind of all of the catharsis without the obligation now.
I think that's very, very well put, actually, because it is that question of commitment that we were discussing earlier, which you need that, you have the banality of it, I guess, the banality of commitment, at the same time as, or at least the kind of ideal, I guess, that we're discussing is something which involves commitment and subordinating your will to the other, at the same time as also having perhaps something a little bit grander.
Right. And what the feminist discourse neglects in a nutshell is that, maybe we can paint men in broad strokes as like assholes and narcissists and patriarchs, but in our private dealings as women with men in heterosexual relations and in homosexual ones, you owe some sort of level of accountability to the other person. And in an online sphere, there's absolutely no obligation on accountability. To accountability, you can just kind of spout off. But I think, Lana, there's a really great quote from my favorite pop star of all time, Amy Winehouse.
R.I.P.
Yeah, and I think Lana has really taken the reins of Amy Winehouse in a way. But I think Amy was asked in an interview about modern versus kind of 50s and 60s pop music, and she put it really beautifully. I'm like obviously paraphrasing here, but she said, like, I identify with kind of the love songs of the 50s and 60s, particularly from female vocalists, because they were this plaintive expression of need. I want you, I need you, I love you, I depend on you. And if you look at pop songs these days, especially the ones that are marketed for women, like from Beyonce or Ariana Grande or Selena Gomez or Rihanna, the message that you get is, I'm a girl boss. I'm like stacking paper. I don't need you. And that's patently not true, because, what the Me Too movement is about in a nutshell. And I do believe, I've said this before, I do believe that kind of the surface level, aim of bringing sexual predators to justice is a noble one. But really, what women are groaningly, miserably angry about is that men are indifferent. They're not hostile. They don't protect you anymore, as Jenny Holzer said, if they ever did.
I think, yeah, that's right. And I think that the yearning for that is something that comes through very strongly in Lana Del Rey's lyrics, for example, right?
Right. Yeah, certainly. I mean, if you look at this, I think this is from her latest album. If you look at the song Cherry, which is like the song that I have on repeat all the time, it's so Freudian and sexual. Cherry. She compares true love to being kind of like being lined up in front of a firing squad. She compares it to being against the wall. And I think that when you're in your feelings, which is another great Lana song, that's what it feels like, right? That there are no alternatives.
But yeah, I guess then maybe that brings us on to the question, is this a sort of displaced longing, right? That this is a longing which belongs maybe not necessarily to intimate romantic relationships, because at the end of the day, people are still capable of that. I don't think the contemporary culture has corroded that to such an extent, but that perhaps there's more of a longing for genuine public emotion, grand emotions, things to actually care about, maybe ideology or, communism would be my answer, but, I don't want to be too crude about it.
Kind of a great project that you can express your love for and then go to the firing line for.
And that you might be able to submit yourself to, something to believe in, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think that was what was going on kind of in the Soviet Union in the heyday of Bolshevism, and later with the rise of constructivism, they were trying to create kind of a monumental aesthetic program that people could be moved and heartened by. And you see this in America too, with kind of the golden age of cinema and the golden age of music. And all these things, I mean, I think these things are politically moving precisely because they were personally moving.
And I guess if that's displaced onto personal relationships, that's quite a lot to expect. One other person, or a very small number of people individually to kind of give you in replacement for what was previously a social project.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, can you clarify that for me for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can't remember whose point this is, because it's not mine, and I shouldn't claim it to be mine when it's not. But the idea that if you don't have anything else to invest your hopes and your dreams in society, or the construction is that you can achieve fulfillment only through interpersonal relationships, and specifically romantic ones, and that's how you find your soulmate and find completion, forget about a wider social project, then you're going to be, it's quite likely that you're going to be disappointed because one other person is expected to do quite a lot to complete you and offer you kind of all these various things, from intellectual fulfillment to friendship and all these other things.
Right.
So
I think that was a great point that Quentin Crisp, who everybody should read, made. That kind of the animating force of human nature is to foist responsibility for your life onto someone else. I mean, it's a tightrope, it's a balance, right? But now what you see, I think that there's something kind of more nobler in the message advanced by people like Amy Winehouse and Lana Del Rey, that you seek some sort of solace or redemption in romantic love, because now that individualism has been completely parlayed into work and self-actualization in a professionalized marketplace, which has left everybody feeling completely alone and miserable and siloed.
Yeah, I think the kind of the glorification of one's own personal brand has kind of replaced the tacit progressivism, which I guess could be called Americanism, at least in the United States. But there are, kind of maybe variations of it elsewhere, like across the West, I guess. But some sort of public ideology which coheres and gives a link between one's public experience and one's own private life, and some sense of telos about where society is heading. And of course you get kind of, more radical versions of that in communism and socialism. You also get a kind of more despairing version in conservatism, and trying to hold back the flood, standing athwart history and yelling stop. But I guess in the absence of that, you start looking for it in other sort of places. I think one thing that kind of brings to mind is that what the one kind of big emotion that can be drawn out of people, or that comes from individuals, from liberals especially today, is the fear of fascism. Like, that's the big, grand, public thing that we can tie into. We need to stop some sort of, great reaction, some great disaster.
We say that right now as we talking all week about incoming fascism in Bristol, which is actually...
Well, here it's a genuine fear. My fears are real. They're not like the fake ones elsewhere.
But don't you think kind of the leftist and liberal preoccupation with fascism is a little bit overblown, especially...
Well, that's precisely my point. That is exactly my point.
And sorry. I think, there's this whole idea that, right, I've seen so many headlines to the effect of the alt-right has been completely brought to its knees by the Antifa movement. And that's not the case at all. The alt-right was basically, it dissolved because of infighting, and because it was never a coherent movement to begin with, much like Me Too. And because the kind of major payment processors refuse to host these people. It has nothing to do, there's this idea that 12 alt-right guys met with 1,000 Antifa protesters in the nation's capital, and it's not that they were humbled by the sheer numbers of progressives coming out to challenge them. It's that they were a fringe movement to begin with.
Well, totally. And I think something that we've discussed on this podcast before, and I suspect we might all be in agreement about it, but that a lot of right-wing populism that has emerged in the past 10 years is a sort of return of the repressed. It is a desire for politics which has been suppressed by centrist neoliberalism, the kind of preclusion of politics, and, the fact that you can't call out your enemy. Everything has to be wrapped up in a consensual framework. And so then that gets expressed out in kind of more violent, reactionary or racist forms. And so the repetition of liberal prescriptions of more consensus, let's all get along, let's let the experts get on with ruling, only compounds
the bipartisan, reaching across the aisle,
exactly,
party line, yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess then, I'm trying to kind of double back again to the kind of to the fear of fascism, that because maybe liberals feel that kind of consensual form of politics is so insubstantial that the only thing they have to really cling on to as a motivating factor, as a legitimating factor for themselves, is to shout about impending fascism, impending doom of some sort, which is the great big dramatic public thing that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally a boogeyman, because the real doom is going to come from their internecine warfare, and also the onward march of like massive digital platforms. That's what we have to fear, is kind of the total monopoly power of technology and the internal strife that these communities face. I mean, right now, if you look at the left right now, at least the sad thing is that there are a lot of people who are on the left who are involved in good faith organizational efforts all across the globe, but the kind of forward-facing PR arm of the left are people on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and such, and these people are basically now in the business of calling out other leftists for being fascists. It's like this roundabout, this circle jerk.
It's completely cannibalistic.
It's like, this. I mean, I'm going to share a really stupid Twitter experience today. Like, somebody from South Africa, actually, where I'm from, when I was like pointing out that weirdly in Brazil, a lot of people who would be like Hillary voters, like members of the resistance types, like professional upper middle class types, are considering, or at least probably going to vote for a actual fascist in the name of the lesser evil. Somebody was like, but of course, white liberals are always terrible. They're like, also the white left don't like to vote for people that are not like them, they don't look like them. And I was just trying to think, I've actually never met somebody on the left who, in the United States, who would even consider voting for Trump. It's like, this is like an imaginary category that suddenly has perseverance, but it's useful to a narrative. So like suddenly you have the rarely racist white leftists which would consider voting for Trump. And even if there are racist white leftists, because there's going to be racist with any demographic category, the idea of that type of thing doesn't exist. But yet it serves a narrative which was originally from liberals, but now it's being promoted by the left as it's convenient.
What do you mean, the idea that Trump's voter base is more robust than it is?
Well, no, the idea that there's a imaginary category of white leftists who would consider voting for Trump out of sex.
Oh, right. I mean, you saw this in kind of in the kind of on the eve of the wind up to the presidential election. There was this whole category of media feminists who are basically saying, well, the Bernie bros were red pilled and have now turned into Trump, MAGA guys.
This discourse really emerged in Europe in the past couple of years as well, with a sort of completely fictitious and fantastical supposed red-brown alliance, right? Where
there's the red-brown, the closest to a red-brown alliance you can get in terms of actual left stuff is if you ever go to the Counterpunch website. There's always some really fringe articles there. But in terms of any real organization constituting an alliance with fascism, no. I mean that's just unimaginable.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's no data, no evidence.
But it's a useful narrative. So you have this whole category of people who somehow get Twitter points of saying that Jacobin is proto-fascist with social democracy, and they always go red-brown.
Right. Yeah, I remember when Connor Kilpatrick wrote the article about child rearing in 2018. It was kind of an anti-natalist argument.
Topic of our last episode, actually.
Oh, really?
we had Amber on to talk about.
Oh, right. Oh, great. I'm going to give that a listen. But I mean, there was a massive pylon, and nothing that he said was really that controversial. He was being perfectly reasonable.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I guess the liberal program is ever further alienation. And so don't trust liberals. They will betray you and eventually go fascist.
Well, I mean, this is a scary thing. And I think on one hand, it goes without saying, it does not bear repeating. The idea that the left is kind of the opponent of neoliberalism is kind of true on the face of things. But everybody on the left, including myself, I mean, we're all guilty as charged. We have been kind of infected by neoliberal ideology to the degree that we can only think of things from the point of our individual interests. There is no the idea of like reaching across the aisle and a bipartisan consensus is about basically what is it, like coming together with people who you fundamentally disagree with to promote kind of the lesser evil alternative, but there really is no sense of coming together in favor of mutual class or economic interests, and while kind of putting aside your identitarian differences.
Well, liberals love to talk about change while at the same time militating against any possible real change. And it's like that line from The Leopard, which is the, we need to change so that everything may stay the same. And that, I think, is the basic proposition of a lot of liberalism. And that includes, unfortunately, certain sections of the left.
Mm-hmm. And I'm very glad that you bring up this point about change, because that is kind of the central animus of the narcissistic personality, which I think Christopher Lasch said first, and TLP said even better years, decades down the line, that narcissism is sort of the generational pathology of our age, like hysteria, let's say, was in Freud's day. And I think it's completely not a facile analogy to say that liberal is just a handy political euphemism for narcissist, because really, no joke, no lulls, because the kind of the narcissist is poised against change, which is what makes them kind of such a ideal candidate, as Lasch says, for interminable psychoanalysis.
Well, I think that's a lovely loop back, and maybe a great place to stop, because that just resumes it all very nicely, and it's good to kick the liberals right at the end.
All right, that's it for now. If you've liked what you've heard, do tell your friends and share Alpha Bunga Bunga on your favorite social network. We're back in 2 weeks talking to Alex Gurovich about douchebag entrepreneurs and why these Silicon Valley types are actually quite dangerous figures. Also coming up over the next month, we have Duterte's murderous regime in the Philippines, nervous states and political mistrust with Will Davis, and the link between liberalism and fascism with Ishai Landa. As always, get in touch. If you think there's this big thing going off in Micronesia or Central Africa that we need to discuss, then tell us. Okay, till next time, catch you later. Bye-bye.